Welcome, Edward Ellegood. We are so excited to talk with you today. Thanks so much for spending some time. For our listeners, tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to be involved in space. I know it's a long, amazing story, but just an overview for us.
Hi, it's great to be with you. And yeah, I've had a twisted path into the space business, having started as an intern in the Florida Department of Commerce in Tallahassee. And I became a speechwriter and then an economist in the Office of Space Programs. And that organization basically took the role of creating what's now Space Florida. So I moved from Tallahassee down to the Space Coast way back in 1990 to start up the state's Spaceport Authority.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. And I mean, Kevin says all the time, space is this small world, right? And I met Kevin. I was the speech and debate coach at our school, and our kids were like, his kids were building satellites, and they were talking to me about it. And he says it's always a small world, right? Well, one of our first podcasts is actually with a lot of people from Space Florida. So when I was reading that in your bio, I was like, oh my gosh, of course, he seems to know everybody that we probably have already interviewed. So small world there. So you were a speechwriter and when you're first writing, so were you said with the Department of what was it? The Department of Commerce, but you were writing about space at the time?
Well, sometimes the Commerce Department, of course, covered all of the state's economy. And at that point, space was beginning to become a focus for the state. Some folks from down here in the Cape Canaveral area went up to Tallahassee and said, hey, you guys really need to do something about commercial space, because it's not just NASA and the military anymore. And other states are really turning on to attracting commercial space business. In fact, Hawaii at that time had plans for a commercial spaceport. So wow. That really lit the fire under Florida. They didn't want to see another state capture our space launch industry. And a commission was created by the governor. And I was at that time an economist and played staff to that commission. So I wrote their final report and did all the research for that. And one of the recommendations of that group was to create a spaceport authority, like an airport authority or a seaport authority, but focused on supporting the space transportation industry. And to start up that effort, they created, or the legislature created a governmental spaceport authority. And I was selected to move down from Tallahassee to Brevard County to start that up. So we hired an executive director, and I was his first staff member.
That's fantastic. So when I got involved reading the report, I want to say I met J.D. Mukherjee, Florida Space Grant Consortium Director, in about 2001, 2002. But I started reading, and I believe there was like 3 organizations at the time. There was the Spaceport Authority, there was FSRI, Florida Space Research Institute. Right. Was FSI, was that one of the 3 organizations that got merged, or am I missing one?
Yeah, you're missing one. Actually, it took several years before those other organizations were created. The Spaceport Florida Authority, I was with that organization for about 10 years before the state decided to spin off a research institute. And that was the Florida Space Research Institute. And they also spun off a Florida Aerospace Financing Corporation.
Yes, that's right.
And that organization was run by Frank DeBello, who's now the head of Space Florida.
Oh, wow.
So I peeled off from the Spaceport Authority to help start up the Space Research Institute. We hired Sam Durrance, a former astronaut, to lead that effort. And that's before that is where I really started working with Jaydeep Mukherjee and the Florida Space Grant Consortium based at UCF. While I was at the Spaceport Authority, I was responsible for university programs and research and development and workforce development activities. So it was logical that I become part of that spinoff to this research institute. But so while still at the Spaceport Authority, I was working with UCF, with FIT, with Embry-Riddle, UF, and other universities throughout the state. And while we were, I forget whether it was before or after we spun off FSRI, we decided to work with those universities and create a kind of a partnership that is now the Florida Space Institute.
Yes.
FSI. And UCF became the lead university in FSI. So as the host for the Florida Space Grant Consortium, Jaydeep was a part of all of that activity at the time.
Is the FSI is still around today? Is that correct?
That's correct. They are not quite what we envisioned it to become. We saw an organization composed of the representatives from each of those universities to create a board of directors, if you will, that would guide what programs and funding, where funding would go and so forth. Turns out UCF became kind of the major force, and they really own FSI, and I'm not sure what extent the other institutions are involved at this point, beyond Jaydeep's organization, the Space Grant Consortium, and their NASA mandated role to involve other universities.
Right.
They're different from FSI. They're kind of subsumed by FSI, but they've got their own charter by NASA.
Right. Well, I know Jaydeep has tried to help elevate some of the programs at schools that maybe aren't as well known with aerospace. I know he's put a lot of effort into that. Well, out of all of this incredibly rich history with Florida and their space economy, is there a particular time or a period of time where you felt like you were being most effective, or you could see what was on the horizon? And just tell us, is there any moment that really stands out now as you look back over the last 30 years?
Well, the Spaceport Authority had a secret sauce, and that was its ability to finance space projects in ways that other state organizations, not just in Florida, but in other states that are trying to compete with Florida, that they couldn't do. And we ended up providing innovative financing for all sorts of projects, including the conversion of several launch pads at the spaceport, the development of launch processing facilities and rocket support facilities at the Cape.
Was the Spaceport Authority like a sort of like a line item in the state budget where you got some money, but you were given a little autonomy? Or how would you, what was the secret sauce in terms of, was it autonomy, or was it budget, or maybe a little both, or something I'm not aware of?
Well, the Spaceport Authority got about $10 million a year in state appropriations. And we ended up building these facilities and taking an ownership role in them and leasing them to companies. So that was another revenue stream. And also the constant pursuit of federal grant monies and federal appropriations. That secret sauce I talked about, airport and seaport authorities are what are termed special purpose districts, special purpose entities. And they allow certain tax-free financing for the transportation infrastructure. And being a spaceport authority, the first of its kind, we were able to apply that kind of innovative financing to these spaceport infrastructure projects. And it was very attractive to companies that needed to invest in new infrastructure at the Cape because they could take, there were some interesting tax maneuvers that could be done that wouldn't otherwise be available to them. So it ended up being quite interesting for these large companies who were normally dependent on federal appropriations or putting their own money on the line. Now they had another avenue for building some of this infrastructure. And the Air Force and NASA also found it very interesting because while they had a lot of infrastructure that needed modernization or development, they couldn't always depend on the federal construction budgets to come through and provide the money that they need. So they saw the state as being able to step in and bridge the gap between what they wanted and what they could afford.
Right. Well, even in the 90s, you were probably revitalizing and refurbishing early 1960s era facilities, were you not? I mean, weren't there a lot of those pads built in the 1960s?
Oh, yeah. In fact, one of the commanding generals at the 45th Space Wing back then, they had it was almost a joke that they were continuously trying to upgrade outdated infrastructure. And he envisioned, at the time it was, maybe 2005, and he wanted to bring 1960s infrastructure up to 2000 level technology by 2015. So, they were always behind the times trying to bring their facilities up to, modern specs.
I got to meet Frank DeBello, and also I believe it was Dale Ketchum of Space Florida. We were working with our students, middle and high school students, and we were taking them up for Florida Space Day, which is actually something we're about to do again this coming week. Did they have that as early back as when you started, the idea of going to Tallahassee and talking with legislators to advocate on behalf of space policy?
Yeah, I was part of starting Space Day in Tallahassee, and it was interesting. The companies weren't used to lobbying at the state level, and we frankly weren't allowed to ask them to lobby for us. But through other organizations like the Florida Space Business Roundtable and other groups that we were part of, we were able, and with NASA and Air Force support, able to take over the first 2 floors of the Capitol building and have booths for the different companies and have NASA bring their astronaut suit and with someone in it to look around and take photos. And we would go to the legislators' offices to talk about what kinds of space spending would benefit the state.
If you fast forward that to 2019, right before COVID, we actually had 5th, 6th, and a couple of 7th graders with talking points, and they got their picture with Eileen Collins, and it was all of that in the Rotunda area. Fantastic.
Well, that's how I kind of started working with Kevin. I was just, like I mentioned earlier, just the debate coach whose kids were, so how could I tie my card to this, right? And so, we had kids who were like, why aren't other kids at other schools doing this? And so we actually worked, when we were working with at the time, it was Congressman Brian Mast at the federal level. And we're like, so we were able to kind of get our real debate, cut our teeth, if you will, by going to these legislative blitzes, both at DC for the AIAA and there at the Capitol for Space Florida. It was really incredible. And even this year, we're bringing brand new students back, they know very little about aerospace. We're at a new school. So, it's interesting to kind of see where we had these kids that eventually were trained to the point where they were training other students to do the talking points. And then we're starting all over again. So it's, I can't wait to share with them that I'm in a
the legislators really love to see local constituents, especially students.
That's what we
found. Students in very nice clothes that know talking points, right? It's very good. I want to pivot just a little bit back to some of your projects. I'm curious, were you responsible back in the day for building the Space Life Sciences building there at Kennedy Space Center? Is that one of your projects?
It was. I actually have a NASA Group Achievement Award for designing and developing the.
That's fantastic.
Lab. That was with the Florida Space Research Institute, and it was a controversial project for a while because it was built around the needs of the International Space Station, envisioned to become the laboratory for all experiments that flew to and from the space station. And NASA's budget for the space station was a big factor in plans for developing it. And NASA also signed on to be an anchor tenant in that facility. So we built a lot of laboratories specifically for NASA's research requirements. And then NASA had to back away from that commitment. As I mentioned, the federal budget process is never set in stone.
Volatile.
Not something you could go to a bank and say, hey, loan us this money because the federal government's going to have a contract with us. They have these clauses that allow the federal government to back out of agreements like that because they can never be totally sure that the legislators or congressmen or whomever will actually follow through on appropriating the monies. So NASA had to back out of a lot of their utilization commitments for the Space Life Sciences Lab. And the facility was quite empty for a long time, not totally empty, but we had our Florida Space Research Institute offices moved into it, and now Space Florida's headquarters are there. That's not long after that was finished, the Florida Space Research Institute was dissolved and it became Space Florida's issue.
Right. I want to share with you two little flashbacks for me that tie into things that you've said. First of all, right now, we have two CubeSats on orbit and we have a couple of others in the pipeline. We're getting ready to integrate our third hosted payload this spring for a flight later this year. And then our fourth one's on the drawing board. But we have this really high-speed 8th grader who's very excited and wanting to do projects. He's been very active with us for about 3 years. He has family from Brazil and Israel, and he is actually reaching out to Space Pharma, one of the tenants in your Space Life Sciences building, with the Florida-Israeli partnership that Space Florida does. And he is our lead for that. So I want you to think about this. We got a 12-year-old that's leading an effort to do a joint project with an Israeli company in the Space Life Sciences building. So I think that's pretty cool now that I know that you were the guy that was there when it was being built. And
yeah, very interesting.
Yes. And my second little story for you is 21 years ago when I had been in industry. I had a sick kid and I needed a job where I wouldn't travel, and my daughter's school offered me a job. So I went from industry to teaching pretty quickly, and I immediately wanted to do as much space as I could. So my very first field trip, I took the kids to meet Dr. Mukherjee. I had met him, and I met Sam Durant's at the same time. So I met Sam Durant's at back when the Florida Space Grant offices were there in the Astronaut Memorial Foundation building. So that's how small the world is when you talk about it. And especially since I
remember you back then.
What's that?
I remember working with you back then.
I remember
probably in the room when that meeting with J-Deep and Sam happened.
That was 21 years ago, if you could imagine that. I had no idea what I was doing, right? I'm still not sure, but 20 plus years of grinding, and we're finally getting some stuff up. But man, it's a great time to be alive in Florida and aerospace, right? I mean, did you live in Florida like when Apollo shut down? Were you a kid then, or were you? I know you were around in the middle of it when the shuttle program shut down. Those are some very dark times, were they not?
Yeah, it was bleak here, and I do go back to the Apollo days, the late Apollo days. I grew up in the Panhandle of Florida. and ended up going to university at Florida State in Tallahassee. And it was fortuitous that I got an internship there that led to all of this space stuff that I've been involved in for decades now.
You gotta like it or you wouldn't stay in it. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, but I was never one of the kids who had a drive to be in space. Like so many I meet now, that they're here because that's been their life's dream. It just kind of happened for me by chance that this space effort in the state happened while I was, basically a speechwriter in the communications office.
Well, I get your newsletter, right? And so I see you cover so many aspects of space that most of us aren't even aware that's happening. When you think about where we are now versus what you've covered, what's most exciting for you right now in the space world?
Well, you mentioned my newsletter, the Florida SPACeREPORT, and I produced that when the email was not a thing. It began as a fax that I would send to the governor's office as here's an update of what's going on in this new industry that we're focusing on down here. And then people started saying, hey, can you send that fax to me as well? And I ended up having to, at the end of the day, press send on a mass fax, and it would take all night long until the next morning for it to reach everyone. And back then it was, maybe bi-weekly. And now I send that thing out to probably 1,500 direct recipients on email. And it's a big task to put it together every week. But what I've noticed is it's gotten denser and longer, and a lot more lately content on what the startups and entrepreneurial folk are doing to change the space industry. It's practically dominated by the new space business efforts.
Right. Well, I always see hot topics on the top, then it sort of works through companies, but you always put the foreign countries. It looks like all the international stuff's at the back end. Am I reading that right?
That changes. Usually I start with what the spaceports and launch business is up to. And then I either go into military space or what NASA's doing or what the entrepreneurial space business types are into. And then I end with what errata stuff that I don't know where to put. And
right. Well, here, this is a great question, since we're talking to the organizer of this. What determines if you put a hyperlink or not in an article? Because I'm like, this is something I want to read. I don't want to have to go find it. I just want to click the here, something like that, read more about it here. What determines when you're putting your articles in, I'm going to put it in the weekly report, but I'm not going to put a hyperlink on it?
Well, you'll notice that I never have anything that's longer than 3 paragraphs for any one item. And if I can't capture the gist of the article in 3 paragraphs, then I'll shorten it and add a hyperlink to it.
Got it.
Right. So to read more here. Now I'm thinking about it too. So how that obviously keeps you very busy, not just in the creation of it, but you have to do the research for that. So do you have like contacts at all these places, or are you just reading copious news yourself in order
to
generate that?
Feeds? Do you have like 10 daily news feeds?
Yeah, I do.
I'm not surprised.
I have a few, but I figured you had a much more extensive list. Do you have a lot of paid subscriptions that gives you the kind of volume that you need for your report?
Just a few to the local newspapers that require it, but also helpful to me is keeping it down to 1 or 2 or 3 paragraphs. Normally, I can get that from not having a subscription to a publication.
Right. It's like the Blinkist, right? I think they use that for books. Instead of people reading the whole book, they can read that. But I can only imagine, just because I do a little newsletter for what we do with our students, and the time involved in creating it is a lot. Are you doing this just because you love doing it now, or is it part of, something that you're doing for your career, or just because at this point we're all expecting it?
Yeah, I know. Well, as I said, I started it as a update to the governor's office every month, every week or two. And it became part of my job to distribute that to the masses while I was working for the state. And after I left the state's employment, they didn't have the wherewithal or the interest to keep doing it internally. I had the know-how to continue to do it. And I just considered it a public service that I could continue to do. And it does take a lot of my time, but thankfully a lot of my employers since then have allowed me to spend at least some time doing the space report. And sometimes I give them advertisement in it or.
Oh, good.
Well, I have to tell you, I read your report weekly, religiously, even when I was in Washington, D.C. for 6 years as working at the National Science Foundation. 15 years of reading it. And then one day I come across a blurb about my own conference. That was spectacular. It was a little meta.
He still talks about it. Like he was just talking about it just today.
So I was very, it was cool, right? It's like validation when you make Edward's report.
I'm always happy to put event news or any local space news activity in there. If you ever want to send anything, or anyone does that they think is newsworthy, I'm usually willing to put it in.
Well, we'll take you up on that. And I know we only have a few minutes left, but I don't know if you knew that. And I don't know if Kevin knows, but I think after having read his bio, the two of you have an award in common for the Space Workers Hall of Fame. You were recently inducted in that. Is that right?
Yeah, this year.
And I think Kevin, you were what might have been 2 years ago,
I think so. I was a COVID inductee. So, but mine was education. That's sort of the lane that I run in. Is I can't decide, one foot in both worlds. But that's a very, congratulations on that. You got what, 3.5 decades of supporting Florida's aerospace industry. It's very, it's awesome. I can't tell you how grateful I am. We actually had a chance to speak with you today.
As we do wrap it up, if someone were interested in getting the space report, this is now a good time for you to share out any of your social media links or how someone could hear from you. So if you want to just give that information out, maybe we can get you a few more people to add to your list.
Yeah, it's free, and there is a sign up on the newsletter itself, so you can click on that. I don't want to read the long string of letters that sign up form is on the internet, but
that's okay. I'll link it in the show notes. I'll put it up on the show notes for them. That'd be great.
I have a LinkedIn page for the Florida Space Report. You can find it there, and Twitter as well. And both of those you can find links to, probably to sign up for the newsletter, which is free and goes out every Sunday night.
Yes, it does.
Well, we really appreciate you giving us this time today. We look forward. We hope to be able to talk with you again, or maybe the next time that you do your education conference will be coming up this year. Maybe we have you come out and cover it if you're up in the area. That would be fantastic.
Sure. Yeah, when that happens, and I'll make sure to put it on my calendar for the newsletter. And not just for the calendar, but I can put a banner advertisement for free or something like that would help you.
That's great. Our goal is to make it as close to free as we can for educators and students. That's our goal. So that would be great because you have a great distribution list.
Yeah. Well, we want to thank you so much again. And, we'll look forward to hearing from you on next Sunday's report. But in the meanwhile, we hope to have you back again as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Edward.